A school bus carrying 27 children and their driver vanished without a trace from the quiet town of Napa Island. For decades, the case remained one of the most haunting mysteries until a big mystery was uncovered 39 years later. The morning of October 12, 1984, began with the sort of anticipation that only children can summon. On Napa Island, an isolated yet close-knit community off the coast, excitement rippled through the air. The pupils of Napa Island Elementary had been promised a rare treat, a day trip to the mainland museum. For many of the children, ages 7 through 12, it would be their first adventure beyond the island's quiet shores. They had packed their lunches the night before, laid out their best clothes, and clutched permission slips as though they were golden tickets. As dawn broke, parents dropped their children off in school, warning them not to linger, their voices muffled by the mist. Once it was 10 a.m. and all the pupils were already in school, ready for the treat. One by one, they stepped into the bright yellow school bus. Behind the wheel sat Mr. Henry Caldwell, a man beloved by nearly every family on the island. In his early 40s, with gentle eyes and laugh lines carved deep into his weathered face, Caldwell had driven Napa Island's school routes for nearly 20 years. He was more than a bus driver. He was a guardian. Parents trusted him implicitly, knowing that their children were safe in his care. Caldwell knew each child by name, knew whose shoelaces were always untied, who preferred the window seat, who hummed softly when nervous. That morning, as the children climbed aboard, he greeted each one with the same warmth. "Good morning, champ," or "Climb on in, sweetheart." The bus filled quickly with chatter, bursts of laughter, the creak of seats as kids leaned to show each other trading cards or sandwiches packed in foil. Their voices rose and fell like music, muffled only by the steady hum of the engine. At 10:15 a.m., the bus pulled away, headlights cutting weakly through the dense fog, and began its route along the winding roads that led toward the mainland museum. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary departure. Several neighbors waved as it passed. A shopkeeper remembered seeing the faint outline of the bus lumber by, headlights like pale eyes in the mist. A fisherman driving his pickup swore he had pulled aside to let it pass near the crossroads. There was nothing unusual, nothing alarming, until suddenly there was nothing at all. By 12 o'clock, when the bus failed to appear at the mainland museum, workers at the mainland museum were concerned but not panicked. Napa Island was known for unpredictable weather, and delays happened. By 12:15, though, phone calls began. By 12:30, the managing director at the mainland museum awaiting the arrival of the pupils had put a call through to the school authority. He reported that no bus had arrived at the museum. Parents rushed to the school, clutching their coats against the wind, demanding answers the teachers didn't have. Within hours, a frantic search was underway. Sheriff Daniel Hobbs, a grizzled man whose family had lived on Napa Island for generations, coordinated deputies and volunteers. Roads were scoured. Fields were searched. Neighbors opened barns, sheds, and garages, praying against reason that the children had simply gone astray. Search dogs were brought in, noses pressed to the ground, but the scent trail ended abruptly on Seaview Road, as if the bus had vanished into the fog. The island buzzed with disbelief. The school gymnasium became a command center, its walls lined with maps and photographs of smiling children. Mothers clung together in clusters, trembling as they whispered prayers, while fathers paced in tight circles, their faces taut with suppressed rage. Volunteers poured in from the mainland as news spread that a bus conveying Napa Island's children was gone. Reporters arrived within days, their vans crowding the narrow streets, their questions piercing raw wounds. Yet for all the manpower, for all the determination, no evidence emerged. Not a scrap of metal, not a shred of fabric, not a single footprint out of place. It was as though the bus had been swallowed whole by the island itself. Theories sprouted almost instantly, each more desperate than the last. Some whispered of a runaway driver, though those who knew Caldwell scoffed at the thought. The man adored the children, often lingering after his route to toss a baseball with them or fix a stubborn bicycle chain. Others suggested a tragic accident, that perhaps the bus had veered into the thick woods and overturned, hidden from view. Helicopters combed the tree line for days, but the forest yielded nothing. A darker theory gained momentum: kidnapping. But who could orchestrate such a feat on an island with only 2 roads leading in and out? The logistics seemed impossible, yet so too did the disappearance itself. Tension deepened when a local farmer, Earl Jennings, stepped forward with a claim that unsettled many. Earl was a solitary man, known for his reclusive habits and weathered skin from years in the fields. He swore that on the morning of the disappearance, he had seen strange flashing lights in the woods bordering Seaview Road. Like car headlights, he said, but brighter, like they didn't belong. He insisted the lights moved erratically, vanishing into the trees. Deputies took his statement but dismissed it quickly. Earl was known for his tall tales, and with the town already spiraling into panic, few gave his words weight. A flashing light during the day? How can it even be seen where there's sunlight? Many dismissed his claim. Still, his claim lingered in hushed conversations. Mothers clutched rosaries tighter. Fathers scowled at the horizon, as if the fog itself had turned hostile. Children who remained on the island whispered rumors of monsters in the woods or ghosts that had stolen their classmates away. Nights grew longer. Vigils stretched into the early hours, the glow of candles flickering across tear-streaked faces. Churches overflowed with mourners pleading for divine intervention. Yet every dawn brought the same unbearable silence. No bus, no children, no driver. As the days bled into weeks, hope withered. The island's once proud spirit cracked under the weight of absence. Parents who had once laughed together on playground benches now avoided each other's eyes, each trapped in their private abyss of grief. Businesses suffered, tourism evaporated, and the very soul of Napa Island seemed to dim. By the end of October, officials quietly admitted what no parent wanted to hear. There were no leads. Theories, yes. Desperation, plenty. But evidence, nothing. It was as if, on that fog-drenched morning, the bus and its passengers had been erased from existence. And yet, in the darkest corners of the island's grief, a single question refused to fade. If the bus had vanished, where had it gone? Time passed, but on Napa Island, the years did not bring healing. Instead, they hollowed the community out like rot in the core of a tree. What had once been a vibrant, bustling island village, a place where fishermen unloaded their daily catch at dawn, where families gathered on the beach for bonfires, where children's laughter carried through the narrow streets, became a shadow of itself. The tragedy of the vanished school bus hung over every corner like a curse. Shops that once thrived on tourists slowly shuttered, their windows boarded up. The ferry stopped bringing in families for vacations. The mere mention of Napa Island became synonymous with tragedy. Outsiders whispered about the place in hushed tones, as though stepping foot on the island meant stepping into sorrow. The locals who remained carried grief like a second skin. Mothers who had once braided their daughters' hair before school now stared blankly out of kitchen windows, the combs left untouched on the counter. Fathers who had once shouted encouragement at Little League games walked silently along the harbor, their hands jammed in their pockets, unable to look anyone in the eye. Children who survived, those who hadn't been on the bus that morning, grew up under the weight of suspicion and survivor's guilt. "Why them and not me?" they would ask their parents in the dead of night. There were no answers. The school never recovered. Classrooms that once bustled with energy echoed with absence. Desks sat empty, row upon row, like gravestones in a field. Teachers left, unable to bear the silence, the way every lesson felt like a memorial service. By the late 1980s, enrollment dwindled so low that the school closed its doors altogether, leaving the building to rot on the edge of Seaview Road, its broken windows staring out at the forest like eyes clouded with grief. Some families tried to remain, determined to hold on to the only home they had ever known. But grief is a slow poison. By the mid-1990s, many packed up and left, abandoning houses that would later fall into decay. Entire streets stood empty, their once bright paint peeling, shutters banging in the wind. Napa Island, once proud and self-sufficient, became a ghost of itself. For those who stayed, every anniversary of that October day was a cruel reminder. Year after year, they gathered at the makeshift memorial on Seaview Road, candles flickering against the sea breeze, photographs yellowing with age. Parents, now graying and stooped, placed flowers beneath the rusted stop sign where they had last seen their children alive. Some spoke aloud to the wind as if their children could hear them. Others stood in silence, their faces etched with decades of unanswered questions. And always, in the background, lingered the bitter taste of failure. The case had gone cold. The sheriff's office exhausted every resource, and then, quietly, it stopped trying. The official word was simple. There were no leads. But among the islanders, whispers persisted that something darker had silenced the investigation long before the trail truly went cold. It was nearly 2 decades after the disappearance when fragments of truth began to resurface. By then, Detective Alan Rourke, once a young investigator fresh out of training, was an old man. His hair had thinned to gray, his hands trembled with age, and his lungs rattled with every breath, but his memory remained sharp, razor sharp. He had lived with the case his entire life, even after he retired and left the force. It was not closure he sought, but relief from the burden of silence. In a rare conversation with a local journalist, Rourke confessed that, in the fall of 1984, when the search for the bus had consumed every waking moment of the town, he had stumbled across something that shook him to his core. He would not say what exactly he found, only that it was a lead too big to ignore. But when he took his discovery to his superiors, he was met not with urgency, but with cold warning. "They told me to drop it," Rourke said, his voice still carrying the weight of that moment. Not in so many words, but the message was clear. Keep pushing, and I'd be out of a job, or worse. "Who told you?" the journalist pressed. Rourke hesitated, his eyes darting to the shadows of the room as if old ghosts still lingered there. "That's the question, isn't it? Was it the sheriff? The mayor? Someone higher? I don't know who gave the order, only that the order came. I was young then. I thought if I waited, if I kept my head down, the truth would surface. But it never did. It just disappeared, same as that bus." The journalist asked why he had chosen to speak after so many years. Rourke's answer was simple. "I'm dying. Secrets shouldn't outlive the people who keep them." His words ignited fresh speculation on the island, though by then, so few residents remained that it barely rippled beyond the shoreline. Still, for those who had carried grief for decades, the revelation stung like salt in a wound. If Rourke had been silenced, who else had been? How deep did the cover-up go? And more importantly, what had been so dangerous about the truth that it was worth burying along with the children's memory? The case files, dusty and brittle, still sat in the sheriff's archives, untouched for years. Inside were the same photographs that had once blanketed telephone poles. Smiling faces with missing teeth, proud school portraits in stiff collars and dresses. Handwritten witness statements yellowed with time. Maps marked with search grids long faded. But missing from those files was the most important piece, the resolution. Every page ended the same way. No leads, no evidence, case inactive. By the early 2000s, Napa Island was nearly forgotten by the outside world. Houses collapsed under the weight of storms and neglect. The story of the vanished bus lived only in the whispers of those old enough to remember. For newcomers, it was nothing more than a grim legend told over drinks. But for the parents who remained, there was no forgetting. Time had not dulled their wounds. It had only deepened them. Some carried on, their grief hidden beneath routine. Some had given birth to more children. Others succumbed to despair. Marriages fractured. Graves appeared far too early in the island cemetery. Each stone told the same story. A life undone by the absence of closure. Nearly 4 decades after the tragedy, Napa Island had grown quiet in its decay. Overgrown streets wound through abandoned neighborhoods where nature had begun reclaiming what grief had left behind. To the few hundred residents who remained, the past was something they carried in silence. Conversations about the school bus had dwindled to whispers, spoken only at memorial gatherings or late at night after too many drinks. But in the spring of the 39th year, silence was shattered. A construction crew had been sent to clear land on the north edge of the island, near the long-abandoned quarry where stone had once been cut to build seawalls and homes. The quarry itself had been unused for decades, left to fill with weeds and water, its cliffs dangerous and unstable. The plan was to level part of the land nearby for a new water treatment facility. The crews set about their work with heavy machinery, their excavators biting into the earth. It was supposed to be a routine dig, but within hours, one of the machines struck something hard, something that groaned beneath the impact of steel teeth. At first, the workers assumed it was bedrock. Then the bucket of the excavator scraped away soil, and a glint of rusted metal surfaced. The crew gathered around, puzzled. The shape was unnatural, curved in a way no boulder could be. As they dug carefully by hand, more was revealed: jagged windows, twisted steel, paint so corroded it had melded with the soil. Someone muttered, "It looks like a bus." The site foreman froze. For a long moment, no one spoke, but they all knew what it meant. No one on Napa Island could mistake that shape. Authorities were called. Within an hour, the area was swarming with police, forensic teams, and a flood of reporters from the mainland who caught wind of the discovery. The island hadn't seen this much activity in decades. Residents arrived on foot, gathering at the edge of the taped perimeter, their faces pale, their whispers frantic. Old wounds were reopening before their very eyes. When the excavation revealed the full outline, there was no longer any doubt. Buried deep beneath layers of earth and stone lay the missing school bus. Its once yellow paint had been consumed by rust. The windows were black hollows, the wheels half fused with the soil. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a coffin. The bus was hoisted out in fragments, its body screeching as the machinery lifted it into daylight for the first time in nearly 40 years. Cameras flashed, but many of the island's older residents turned away. Some wept openly. Others stood in silence, gripping each other's hands. The most harrowing moment came when investigators entered the interior. What they found inside would haunt the town forever. On the corroded floor lay the remains of children, bones so fragile they crumbled at the touch of air, small skeletons slumped against seats, as though still waiting for the ride to end. Among them were remnants of their lives, frozen in time. School bags, faded and torn, some still holding pencils and folded papers. Shoes, tiny and scuffed, their laces tangled. A broken wristwatch, its hands frozen at 11:12 a.m., the exact time when the children were last seen alive. The scene was unbearable. Investigators worked in grim silence, lifting remains with painstaking care. Parents who were still alive were gently ushered away, though many refused to leave, their cries piercing the still air. The island was in shock. News spread across the nation. For weeks, Napa Island became the focus of endless headlines, talk shows, and late-night debates. The tragedy, long dismissed as a cold case buried in history, was once again alive in the public eye. And this time, there was no looking away. But the discovery was only the beginning. The forensics team set to work immediately, determined to extract every secret the bus still held. Forensic anthropologists reconstructed the remains, cataloging every bone, every fracture. Soil samples were analyzed, fibers collected, fingerprints searched for. At first, the assumption was simple. The bus must have careened into the quarry decades ago, a tragic accident swallowed by the earth. But the evidence quickly unraveled that theory. For one, the bus had not crashed. There was no sign of impact damage to the frame, no shattered glass scattered in the soil, no tire marks leading to the burial site. Instead, it appeared the vehicle had been deliberately placed, buried with machinery after being driven into the quarry and concealed beneath tons of rock and dirt. Then came the autopsies. As much as skeletal remains allowed, experts pieced together the children's final moments. What they found was worse than anyone could have imagined. The children had not died in an accident. They had been alive long after the day they vanished. Bone growth lines suggested they had lived days, perhaps weeks, beyond the disappearance. There were signs of malnutrition, even restraint. It was not a crash. It was a crime. The revelation rippled through Napa Island like an earthquake. Parents who had long clung to the faint hope that their children's deaths had been swift were confronted with a new nightmare. Their children had suffered, waiting, trapped, perhaps calling for them in the dark. The broken wristwatch at 11:12 a.m. became a haunting symbol. Investigators could not determine whether the time was stopped by accident or if it marked something more sinister, an intentional marker left by whoever orchestrated this. The island erupted in grief, but beneath it all, something else began to rise: anger. Why had it taken 39 years to find the bus? Why had authorities dismissed the case so easily back then? And most of all, who had buried it so carefully, so completely, that it had evaded detection for nearly 4 decades? The discovery rekindled every rumor, every conspiracy. People pointed fingers at old officials, at landowners, even at the quarry company itself. Theories spread like wildfire. Some believed it was an inside job, others that the children and the driver had stumbled upon something they weren't meant to see. Forensic teams promised answers, but the process was slow. Every artifact pulled from the bus was treated like sacred evidence. Each shoe, each satchel, was logged and studied. As days turned to weeks, one truth became clear: this was never an accident. Someone, somewhere, had orchestrated one of the most haunting crimes in Napa Island's history. And now, with the bus unearthed and the children's silent voices finally resurfacing, the hunt for the truth had only just begun. The discovery of the school bus should have closed a chapter. Instead, it ripped open a darker one. As forensic teams worked through bones and belongings, detectives dove into the town's archives, determined to unearth the truth that had eluded generations. Their digging quickly pointed to a name that, on Napa Island, carried both weight and menace: the Ashford family. They owned the shipping docks, the lumber mill, and most notably, the quarry where the bus had been found. The Ashfords were not just wealthy. They were the very spine of Napa Island's economy in the 1980s. Their fortune was woven into politics. Local elections were bankrolled by Ashford money, and island officials were often little more than figureheads who bowed to their influence. In the months after the bus's disappearance in 1984, townsfolk remembered the Ashfords paying for candlelight vigils, offering condolences, even hosting fundraisers for the grieving parents. But now, looking back with the harsh clarity of hindsight, those gestures felt different, like a velvet curtain concealing something monstrous. Old records and complaints surfaced from the early 1980s. Former workers had anonymously reported illegal dumping at the quarry. Barrels of toxic waste rolled into pits, evidence covered by truckloads of gravel. Land disputes with farmers, too, were quietly resolved when opponents suddenly withdrew their claims or left the island altogether. None of it ever made the papers. The Ashfords had been untouchable. And yet, a chilling thread began to emerge. Detectives theorized that on the morning of October 3, 1984, the bus carrying the 27 children and their driver, Mr. Caldwell, might have stumbled upon something. Perhaps a convoy of trucks, perhaps men unloading waste, perhaps an activity so incriminating it could not risk witnesses. The location of the quarry and the timing made sense. Then, one afternoon during the renewed investigation, a man walked into the police station. His hair was streaked with gray, his shoulders bent as though carrying the weight of decades. He introduced himself as Daniel Reeves, a lifelong islander now in his early 50s. His voice shook as he asked to speak privately with the lead detective. Daniel revealed that his late father, who had worked for the quarry's construction subcontractor in the 1980s, had confessed something on his deathbed in 1999. "My father was delirious," Daniel said, his eyes wet. But his words were clear. He said, "That bus didn't just vanish, it was buried." He repeated it again and again, like he needed me to remember. At the time, I thought he was ranting. But when I saw the news about the bus being found in the quarry, I knew. The detective pressed him gently. Why had he never come forward before? Daniel's answer was steeped in fear. His father, he explained, had once worked closely with Ashford crews. In 1984, he had been part of a late-night job at the quarry. He came home pale, his hands shaking, and for days refused to speak of it. Only years later, racked by illness, did he break his silence. What he described chilled Daniel to the core. His father claimed he had seen the bus with his own eyes. Not wrecked, not broken, but whole, its windows filled with frightened children and the silhouette of their driver. Under the direction of quarry overseers, heavy machinery began to cover it, shoveling earth and rock until its yellow paint was swallowed by dirt. Men looked away. Some muttered prayers. But no one resisted. This bus was buried a week and some days after it was declared missing. The Ashfords' name was whispered that night. Daniel sobbed as he made the confession. His father was just a laborer, a common man, and he knew better than to challenge them. Speaking out meant ruin. Perhaps worse. Daniel's father resigned from the company within weeks, but the secret clung to him like a curse. He warned his son never to repeat what he'd said, convinced that even mentioning it could invite retaliation. For decades, Daniel obeyed. But now, Daniel said, his voice trembling with grief, they've found the bus. I can't carry his silence anymore. People need to know the truth. The detective's hands tightened around his pen as he wrote every word. This was no longer speculation. It was testimony. And if true, it meant the Ashfords, or those working under them, had committed an atrocity beyond imagination. As news of Daniel's statement leaked, whispers turned into accusations. Islanders who had long harbored doubts began to recall fragments of memory. Trucks rolling down dirt roads in the early dawn, strange tremors beneath the ground, the sudden dismissal of workers who had asked too many questions. One farmer even stepped forward again, this time not dismissed, saying he still remembered the flashing lights in the woods that morning in 1984, lights that lined up with the quarry road. The Ashfords, now represented by the third generation of the family, denied everything. Their lawyers claimed Daniel Reeves's story was hearsay from a dying man. They insisted the quarry had been inactive on the day of the disappearance, that no equipment had been running, that the entire tale was a fabrication meant to smear their name. But the pieces no longer fit their denial. Financial records revealed a surge of unexplained payments made in late 1984 to subcontractors connected with the quarry. Several of the men who had worked on site back then had since vanished, moved off island, or died under peculiar circumstances. And then, the most damning evidence. Investigators discovered traces of diesel residue and hydraulic fluid in the soil layers surrounding the bus, chemical fingerprints matching the very machinery owned by the Ashfords Quarry Company in 1984. The picture was becoming clear. The bus had not simply been buried. It had been entombed with precision, using the Ashfords' own equipment. For Napa Island, the revelation was staggering. The tragedy of the lost children had never been random misfortune. It had been the deliberate silencing of innocence by a family so powerful they thought they could bury both a bus and the truth forever. And for nearly 40 years they had succeeded. But now, with evidence rising from the ground and testimony dragging old secrets into the light, the Ashfords' empire trembled. Still, questions burned. Who among the family had ordered it? Why had the children been left alive when the bus was buried? Was the motive merely to hide illegal dumping, or something even darker? One thing was certain. Napa Island was no longer content with silence. The time for whispers was over. The island wanted justice. And for the first time in decades, the Ashfords had reason to fear. By now, the people of Napa Island no longer clung to theories of accidents or chance. Every revelation from the forensic teams and investigators pointed to something deliberate, monstrous, and orchestrated. But the full truth, when it finally surfaced, proved more horrifying than even the darkest suspicions. Through records, testimonies, and soil analysis, investigators reconstructed the events of that foggy morning in October 1984. Piece by piece, a picture emerged, not of an accident, but of a crime executed in cold calculation. The school bus, carrying 27 children and their driver, Mr. Caldwell, had been traveling the familiar route toward the ferry dock. At some point, whether by mistake or curiosity, the driver steered too far along a back road that cut near the quarry's restricted grounds. In 1984, the quarry was a hotbed of illicit operations. Barrels of toxic waste arriving by unmarked trucks, quietly buried to avoid costly disposal fees. Workers knew the job was illegal. They also knew better than to speak out against the Ashfords, whose reach extended into courts and politics. On that morning, however, the unexpected arrival of a bright yellow school bus changed everything. Witnesses, those who later confessed in hushed tones, recalled the panic among the workers. Dozens of children pressed against windows, pointing, whispering. Mr. Caldwell stepped out, demanding answers, his voice echoing against stone walls. For a few long minutes, there was confusion, shouting, men waving their arms. But then, as one investigator chillingly summarized, the children saw something they were never meant to see. That fact alone sealed their fate. The decision did not come from the workers. Orders were phoned in, passed down from above. Names were never spoken aloud, but everyone knew who above meant: the Ashfords. Within hours, the site transformed from a workplace into a crime scene. The children and Mr. Caldwell were forced back into the bus. Workers recalled the sound of children crying, of fists pounding against glass, of Mr. Caldwell shouting for mercy. After a week, then the machinery roared to life. Excavators and trucks, the very tools once used to carve stone, became instruments of death. Soil and rock were dumped over the bus in relentless waves. The children were alive when the first tons fell, alive as darkness swallowed them, alive as air grew thin and voices turned into muffled screams. The forensic evidence corroborated this nightmare. Microscopic traces inside the bus showed soil particles in the children's lungs, a grim confirmation that they had been breathing underground. The broken wristwatch frozen at 11:12 a.m. likely marked the moment the burial began. For nearly 4 decades, the island believed in disappearance. But the reality was far worse. The children had not vanished. They had been entombed, silenced beneath earth and corporate greed. The horror might have been exposed sooner, if not for the complicity of those sworn to protect the town. Newly declassified records revealed that in 1984, the police chief and the mayor had both received large deposits into offshore accounts. On the very morning the bus went missing, they had been summoned to the quarry. Witnesses swore they left with envelopes, their faces grim. That same evening, they addressed the public, declaring the bus a mystery runaway. Parents screamed in outrage. How could a school bus simply vanish without trace? But the authorities, draped in Ashford money, shut down every lead. Search grids were drawn deliberately away from the quarry. Reports of flashing lights were dismissed as hysteria. The press was fed neat statements about possible runaway driver or mechanical failure. And little by little, as months turned into years, the truth was buried deeper than the bus itself. For 39 years, the island had lived under that lie. But with the bus unearthed, lies began to crumble. DNA testing confirmed the remains of all the children on board, as well as Mr. Caldwell. Forensic scientists worked painstakingly, matching bones to old medical and dental records, providing grieving families with long-denied closure. Each name confirmed was another dagger of sorrow, but also another stitch in the unraveling web of deceit. And then came the revelation that stunned everyone. One set of remains was missing. There were fragments for 26 children and Mr. Caldwell, but not for the 27th. A girl, based on the passenger list, should have been among them, but no trace of her could be found in the wreckage. At first, investigators thought it was an error, perhaps bones scattered or destroyed over time. But multiple sweeps, scans, and cross-checks confirmed the absence. The DNA analysis, repeated 3 times, returned the same conclusion. One child had not been buried in the bus. The implications sent shockwaves through the town. Could there have been a survivor? Some clung to hope. Perhaps in the chaos, one child had escaped before the burial. Perhaps a worker, gripped by conscience, had pulled her free. Perhaps she had been taken elsewhere, hidden, or even adopted under another name. Others feared something darker, that the missing child had been singled out, removed for reasons no one wanted to voice aloud. The island buzzed with theories. Families who had mourned for decades now grappled with impossible questions. Was it worse to know your child had died that day, or to wonder if she had lived, somewhere, somehow, under another sky? The authorities, now under immense pressure, promised transparency. They launched a massive investigation into the Ashfords, into the decades-old cover-up, into the missing child. Subpoenas were issued, records seized, family members questioned. For the first time in nearly 40 years, the Ashfords were no longer the untouchable rulers of Napa Island. The people of Napa Island, once resigned to silence, now marched in protest. They carried faded photographs of their lost sons and daughters, their faces etched with fury and sorrow. They demanded justice, not only for the dead but for the truth itself. And somewhere in the shadows of that truth, a single missing child lingered, her fate uncertain, her absence a question mark that refused to be buried. The investigation that began with the unearthed school bus did not end with the forensics reports. The surviving parents, gray-haired and stooped with age, gathered in town meetings as they had nearly 4 decades before. But this time, there was a fire in their eyes, a determination not to let the truth be buried again. Federal agents moved in, guided by the testimony of the man whose father had carried the damning secret. Every thread they pulled led back to the same knots of corruption: the quarry supervisors, the town's politicians, and ultimately, the Ashford family. The quarry supervisors were among the first to be summoned for questioning. Many were in their late 70s or early 80s now, their bodies frail, their voices quavering. At first, they denied everything. But the weight of their years pressed upon them. They were no longer strong men guarding secrets, but old men staring into the final chapters of their lives. One of them, Harold Jenkins, broke during the second round of interrogation. His hands shook as he pressed a crumpled handkerchief to his mouth, the confession spilling out in fragments between sobs. He remembered the day the bus rolled into the quarry like a nightmare that had stalked his sleep for nearly 40 years. The children's cries. Mr. Caldwell banging on the windows. The orders barked by men in tailored suits, Ashford men. And then, the hiss and roar of machinery as soil was poured over the trapped bus, the children's voices muffled into silence. Jenkins revealed that the Ashfords had called it a necessary accident. They had gathered the supervisors afterward in the foreman's trailer, sliding envelopes stuffed with cash across the table while warning them that any loose tongue would be cut out in silence. For decades, that threat had worked. But now, staring down mortality, Jenkins chose confession over damnation. His testimony cracked open the case like a floodgate. The names he gave matched records. Men who had once sat in Napa Island seats of power. The then mayor, Leonard Wright. Police Chief Samuel Briggs. Both men had walked as pillars of respectability for decades, celebrated in local newspapers, honored at banquets, smiling in photographs that hung in civic buildings. But beneath those smiles was rot. They had not only been bribed, they had actively conspired to smother the story, branding it an unsolvable disappearance and shutting down any lead that strayed too close to the quarry. When the arrests came, they were quiet but seismic. Samuel Briggs, now a frail man tethered to an oxygen tank, was wheeled out of his suburban home as neighbors watched in disbelief. Leonard Wright, once the town's beacon of leadership, shuffled out in handcuffs, his proud shoulders hunched. But it was the Ashfords who shocked the nation. The patriarch, Charles Ashford, had grown old in decadence. For decades, he had remained untouchable, his wealth shielding him from scrutiny. He owned estates, businesses, even charities that bore his name. In public, he was seen as Napa Island's greatest benefactor. But behind those gilded gates, he had ruled like a king, silencing anyone who threatened his empire. The day federal agents stormed the Ashford estate, the image of invincibility shattered. Charles Ashford was found in his study, a frail man wrapped in a cashmere blanket, but the arrogance in his eyes betrayed that he still believed himself untouchable. When read his charges, conspiracy to murder, obstruction of justice, and crimes against children, he scoffed. "You have no idea what you're meddling with," he muttered. But his bluster rang hollow. The trial that followed was nothing short of historic. Survivors and parents filled the courtroom, many leaning on canes or seated in wheelchairs, but refusing to miss a single moment. For some, it was the first time they had heard the truth spoken aloud. Mothers wept openly as prosecutors detailed the horror of the burial. Fathers clenched their fists until their knuckles turned white. The defense tried to argue age, frailty, and lack of evidence beyond testimonies. But the weight of forensic science, combined with confessions and uncovered records, was undeniable. When Harold Jenkins took the stand, his voice cracked as he told the jury about the screams of the children. "It never left me," he said, tears staining his face. "Every night I hear them. I tried to drown it out with drink, with work. But I knew someday God would make me answer for it. And here I am. It was the nail in the coffin." The guilty verdicts came swift. For the Ashford's patriarch and his 3 brothers, for the supervisors who had remained silent, for the officials who had betrayed their oath, the jury found no mercy. The judge, in a rare and uncompromising sentence, declared they would face death by firing squad. It was a punishment that satisfied everybody, an archaic sentence, seldom used. But in this courtroom, with the ghosts of 27 children lingering in every tear shed, it seemed almost merciful compared to the crime. For the parents, it was bittersweet. They had waited nearly 40 years, their lives consumed by grief. Some clutched one another as the sentences were read, whispering prayers of thanks. Others shouted in rage, their anger undimmed by time. But for all, there was closure. Napa Island moved swiftly to sanctify the site of the quarry. What had once been a grave of silence became a memorial. A towering stone was erected, engraved with the names of every child and Mr. Caldwell, the devoted bus driver who had perished with them. Flowers, photographs, and toys soon adorned the site, placed by strangers and locals alike who came to pay their respects. But just as the town began to heal, investigators delivered one final twist. DNA analysis revealed that one set of remains was missing. Every child had been accounted for, except one. At first, speculation ran rampant. Could there have been a survivor? Could a child have been spared? The truth was darker. Digging into Ashford estate records, investigators unearthed a sealed well on the property, long neglected and overgrown with ivy. When it was drained, skeletal remains were discovered at the bottom. Small bones, fragile and unmistakable. Among them was a charm bracelet, engraved with a name that had once been etched onto a schoolbook, Emily Harper. Emily had not died with her classmates. She had been taken, held apart from the others. For how long, no one could say. The evidence suggested she had survived for days, perhaps weeks, before her life was finally extinguished. Why she was chosen remains a mystery lost to time. But the discovery cemented the Ashfords' legacy as not only corrupt, but monstrously cruel. After nearly 4 decades, the silence of Napa Island was broken. The voices of 27 children, once buried beneath soil and lies, were finally heard. Justice, though delayed, had at last been served.